Paddington 2, Chapter 21. A Sinking Feeling. Somewhere far below the seaplane, the fairground train was rushing through the countryside. Phoenix Boochman was taking off his porter's wig as he made his way to the carriage with the organ, clutching the pop-up book close to his chest. The organ was covered with a tarpaulin. Phoenix pulled it off and gazed at the instrument with glee. "Well, grandfather," he said, "now for the moment of truth. At last I shall finish what you started and claim the treasure that is rightfully mine." He opened the pop-up book at the first page. "Tower Bridge, D," he read out. Then he pressed the note on the organ keyboard and a light appeared. "It's working," he gasped, his eyes shining. He turned to another page and another, keying in all the notes. Little did he know that Paddington was watching the whole thing through the window in the carriage behind. Paddington thought of Mr. Brown's words. "If we can find Phoenix in that book, we can prove everything." "But how am I going to do it?" Paddington asked himself. He looked around for inspiration and spotted a barrel of toffee apples. "Aha," he said. "Something sticky. Just what I need." Taking one in each paw, he climbed up the ladder at the end of the carriage and clambered onto the windy roof. He needed to reach the skylight above Phoenix's head. Paddington breathed in sharply as he saw the train was about to go through a tunnel. He ducked just in time and held on for dear life as the train went rocketing through it and out the other side. Thinking on his paws, Paddington stuck the toffee apples to his feet, and then using them as suckers so he wasn't blown away, he made his way across the roof. Phoenix was pressing the last two notes in the code. "F," he said, and "E." Suddenly the whole instrument lit up. Phoenix gazed at the organ, transfixed, while behind him Paddington swung through the skylight, using the toffee apples to hang from the ceiling above. There was a whirring noise as all the cogs in the organ began to turn. The front of the instrument itself began to open slowly, exposing a complex clockwork mechanism in the heart of the organ. Phoenix's eyes grew wide with greed. "Soon the treasure will be mine," he said. Paddington was watching the whole thing. He chose his moment with care, waiting until Phoenix was distracted by the whirling cogs. Then he stretched down to grab the pop-up book from the actor's hands. He was almost there, but just not close enough to touch it. He inched forward on his sticky paws, stretching towards the book. Phoenix was still entranced. The organ was completely open now. He gazed on the clockwork mechanisms as, with more clicking and whirring, a gorgeous, intricately decorated treasure box rose up from somewhere deep inside the instrument. Phoenix reached out his hand towards the object for which he had been hunting for so long. "Hello, my beauty," he cried. Paddington was near enough now to reach the pop-up book. He stretched as far as he could and succeeded at last grabbing the book. Then he turned and began making his way slowly and stickily back to the skylight. Just then the box opened, revealing its treasures. "Aren't you pretty?" said Phoenix as he gazed into its mirrored interior. But something caught his eye in the reflection. Phoenix turned away from the box to see Paddington hanging from the roof above him. "You!" he shouted. He leapt up to grab the pop-up book from Paddington's paw. However, instead he succeeded in pulling Paddington back into the carriage with him. The two of them collapsed in a heap, knocking against the keyboard of the organ. The bump caused the pipes to descend, and the treasure box began folding back into the instrument. "No!" cried Phoenix, lunging for the treasure, but it was too late. It had disappeared back inside to the mechanism. Paddington took advantage of the distraction to grab the pop-up book again. He turned and ran out of the carriage and through the train, leaving Phoenix to try to key in the code again from memory. D, G, no, E, G, no, oh, I'm never going to get it right without that book. With a howl of frustration, the actor ran after Paddington. "Give me that book," he yelled. "Give me that book." The Browns were catching up on the steam train, with Jonathan at the helm. They were getting closer and closer to Paddington's train, but not close enough. "Can this thing go any faster?" Mr. Brown asked, in despair. "I can try to reroute the steam brake, but that'll take a couple of minutes," Jonathan shouted. "And we'll need more coal." "I'm on it," said Mrs. Brown. Try and pull alongside, Mr. Brown said to Jonathan. "If you can get a line in front of that train up there with the back of theirs, I'll be able to get across." "I'll come in with you, Dad," said Judy. "Me too," said Mrs. Bird. "You just try to stop us," she added, as Mr. Brown began to protest. "Come on, then," Mr. Brown said, as he swung out of the cab with the others close behind. They made their way down to the front of the train, while inside Mrs. Brown was furiously shoveling coal into the furnace to keep the train going, and Jonathan was doing everything he could to get the steam train moving faster. Judy, Mr. Brown and Mrs. Bird scrambled to the front of the engine, and they were close enough to be able to climb across to the back of the fairgrain train. Mr. Brown helped Mrs. Bird and Judy across. He had one foot on each train and was about to climb over and join the others, then suddenly the tracks parted. The two trains diverged, and Mr. Brown found himself sliding as his legs moved further and further apart. He closed his eyes and remembered what his acrobatics instructor had taught him. "Open your mind and your legs will follow," he said to himself. His face took on a picture of pure peace as he meditated this phrase. Then, as the trains moved even farther apart, Mr. Brown went into the splits. He opened his eyes, smiling with delight. "I've done it! Oh, no!" he cried, as he saw a bollard in the middle of the tracks getting closer and towards him. "Don't worry, dearie, I've got you," shouted Mrs. Bird, leaning across and pulling him safely to the fairground train. "Thanks heavens for acrobatics," Mr. Brown murmured, mopping his brow. Paddington, meanwhile, was running down the fairground train looking for an escape. He scrambled out of the window and up onto the roof. "I'm coming to get you!" Phoenix cried. He climbed out of the carriage and chased Paddington across the roof. "Where do you think you're going, Bear?" he shouted. "It's a train. It comes to an end like all of us, alas." Paddington turned to see Phoenix gaining on him. He ran faster and faster till he realised Phoenix was right. He was nearly at the other end of the train. He skidded to a halt just as he reached the edge, and wheeled back on his paws to prevent himself from falling. "Whoops!" said Phoenix, striding towards Paddington. Paddington's eyes grew wide in horror as Phoenix came closer and closer. "Exit Bear, pursued by an actor," said Phoenix, laughing. Then, "Whoops!" he cried again, as the skylight opened beneath him, and he went tumbling in the carriage beneath. He landed with a bump in front of Mrs. Bird and Judy and Mrs. Brown. "Mrs. Bird," said Phoenix, blinking up at her. "Ah, you remember me now," she said. Phoenix looked from Mrs. Bird to Judy to Mr. Brown. "The cavalry, the old crone, a little girl, and an insurance man. What are you going to do to me, Henry?" he teased. Mr. Brown put up his fists and glowered at Phoenix. "I'm going to bloomin' well biff you on the nose," he declared. Phoenix raised an eyebrow and coolly grabbed the Swallow's sword from the wall. He brandished it professionally at Henry. "Not a very good idea. I've got stage combat level 4, you know." Mr. Brown gulped and put his fist down. Mrs. Bird had been looking around for a suitable weapon. She spotted a gun on the rack at the end of the carriage. "Where I come from, laddie," she said, grabbing the gun and pointing it at Phoenix, "they teach you not to bring a knife to a gunfight." Judy and Mr. Brown gasped as Mrs. Bird took aim at Phoenix. Phoenix smiled calmly. "I think you'll find that gun shoots only plastic darts." Mrs. Bird pulled the trigger. Sure enough, a plastic dart hit Phoenix smack in the forehead. He pulled it off with a pop, still smiling. "So it does," said Mrs. Bird. "Whereas this sword is razor sharp," said Phoenix. "Now back you go," he added, waving the sword at him and grabbing some handcuffs from behind him. By now, the two lines were coming together again. Paddington glanced out between the two carriages to see the Pullman steam train pulling up alongside once more. "Mrs. Brown!" he shouted. Hearing his cry, Mrs. Brown stuck her head out of the driver's cab. "Paddington, thank goodness," she said, turned back into the cab. "Jonathan, slow down." "OK, Mum," he said, putting on the brakes. The trains were still at least 10 metres apart, with no obvious way for Mr. Paddington to get across to Mrs. Brown and Jonathan. "How am I going to do this?" Paddington asked himself. He looked around for anything that he could use to bridge the gap between the two trains. His gaze fell on a trusty leather suitcase, and an idea began to form. Paddington was not the only one struggling to escape. Phoenix had handcuffed Mr. Brown, Mrs. Bird and Judy to some poles. "Set us free," Mr. Brown growled, wriggling. Phoenix laughed. "I'll deal with you later. But first I'm going to sort out your furry friend." Paddington jammed the door of the adjoining carriage shut before opening his suitcase and pulled out his telescopic window-cleaning ladder. He began to unwind it so it extended towards the Pullman train. He was just beginning to feel hopeful that his plan would work when Phoenix arrived outside the door and began kicking at it, trying to break it down. Paddington jumped onto the front end of the ladder so it took him with it as it stretched further and further across the gap between the trains. Paddington found the handle. He wound it faster still. He was almost across when Phoenix gave the door one last kick and the wood splintered. Further back down inside the fairground train, Judy was panicking. "What are we going to do?" she said, struggling to pull herself free from the handcuffs. "Don't you worry, dearie," said Mrs. Bird. "I've learnt a trick or two from Harry Houdini, the famous escapologist." Phoenix was standing between his carriage and Paddington's. He had caught sight of the bear, who was still trying to make his way across the tracks on the telescopic ladder. "Hello there," the actor called out. He smiled nastily. "What a clever little bear," he said, realising what Paddington was trying to do. Paddington didn't stop to respond to Phoenix, but just kept inching nearer and nearer to Jonathan and Mrs. Brown. Phoenix gave a wicked laugh, and then he leaned forward and pressed the retract button on the ladder. Paddington was immediately pinged back across the tracks. "Whoa!" he shouted as he felt himself fly back into the arms of the evil actor. "Thank you," said Phoenix, whipping the pop-up book out of Paddington's paw. Then he shoved the little bear into the final carriage of the train and slammed the door, throwing the bolts across for good measure. "Let's see you get out of that," he cried, removing the pin that joined the carriage to his own. He leaned out of the carriage and used the pin to knock a trackside lever. The point shifted and Paddington's carriage was disconnected and sent hurtling in a different way down the track. "Bye-bye, bear," said Phoenix. He turned back triumphant, but stopped dead when he saw he was surrounded by coconut stands. Facing him was Judy, her camera clicking away. "Honestly, now is not the time for the paparazzi," said Phoenix, flashing his best movie star grin. "On the contrary, it's the perfect timing," said Mr. Brown, as he lifted his arm and hurled a ball straight at Phoenix's head. Phoenix opened his mouth to cry out, but it was too late. Mr. Brown had knocked him out cold. "Mr. Brown!" Paddington's desperate cries came flooding through the window. "Help me!" Mr. Brown came running to the window, but all he could do was watch helplessly as the runaway carriage crashed through the buffers at the end of the siding. "No!" yelled Henry. Paddington's carriage went hurtling down the slope and into the murky waters of the river below. Mrs. Brown was watching the whole disastrous thing from the Pullman train. "Stop the train, Jonathan!" she ordered. Jonathan pulled hard on the brake lever. The train shrieked to a halt, while the fairground train hurtled off in the distance with Mr. Brown still on board. Mrs. Brown jumped off and shouted to Jonathan to go and get help. She ran to the side of the bridge as Paddington's carriage began sinking into the river. "I didn't do all that training in serpentine for nothing," said Mrs. Brown defiantly. She pulled off her coat and dived into the water. Inside the carriage, Paddington was pushing and pushing at the side door, but it wouldn't budge. Memories of being caught as a baby bear in the fast-flowing Amazon River came flushing back to him. "I survived that," he told himself, and told himself to stay calm. "Aunt Lucy saved me," he thought to himself. He shoved the door, but it still wouldn't open. "But Aunt Lucy isn't here now." It was no good. Paddington was starting to panic. He was struggling to breathe now in the few inches of air that had been trapped at the top of the carriage. He'd given up all hope and was sinking under the water. "This is it," he thought. "I'm sorry, Aunt Lucy. I'll never get you the perfect birthday present now." He turned for one final look through the window at the world above him, which was disappearing fast. And then suddenly Mrs. Brown appeared, swimming towards the door. She was there to save him. Paddington struggled to stay still so that he wouldn't use up the remaining air in the carriage. Meanwhile, Mrs. Brown heaved the door open bit by bit. Paddington could see her face through the crack in the door, but it wouldn't open any further than that. Mrs. Brown looked round frantically to see why the door wouldn't budge. Then she saw it. It had been chained shut. Paddington pushed at the door on his side while Mrs. Brown tugged on hers. They worked together with all their might, but it was no good. The chain was just too strong. Mrs. Brown reached her arm through the gap and took hold of Paddington's paw. They gazed at each other, knowing the end was near. Then Mrs. Brown felt a huge, meaty hand on her shoulder. She looked round and saw to her delight that Knuckles, Fibs, and Spoon were there, right behind her. Above them, on the surface of the water, was the silhouette of the seaplane. They had tracked Paddington down and followed him all the way. Together, the three men and Mary pulled at the door until the chain broke. Mrs. Brown reached in and pulled Paddington out. They swam up, breaking through the surface and gasping for breath. "Thank goodness," Mrs. Brown spluttered as they reached the bank. She helped Paddington out. "Are you all right there, Paddington?" she asked. "I think so, Mrs. Brown," said Paddington shakily. Knuckles, Fibs and Spoon hauled themselves out of the water. "Thank you for coming back, Knuckles," Paddington said to his friend. "But what made you change your mind?" Knuckles smiled ruefully. "Can't make marmalade on my own, now can I?" he said. Paddington gave a tired smile and immediately fainted. Mrs. Brown gasped. She felt his forehead. "He's burning up," she said, looking at Knuckles in alarm. "Best get the little fellow to bed," said Knuckles tenderly.